אהבתי תורתך, אהבתי תורתך, כל היום היא שיחתי. אהבתי תורתך, אהבתי תורתך, כל היום היא שיחתי. אויבה תחכמני מצוותך, כי לעולם היא לי. ואויבה תחכמני מצוותך, כי לעולם היא לי. אהבתי תורתך.
Welcome to Dalet amot shel Halacha. Ein lo lakadosh baruch hu be'olamo ela arba'a amot shel Halacha bilvad. We are in the Shulchan Aruch in Orach Chaim in Siman Reish Ayin Aleph in Halacha Dalet. The Siman 271 in Halacha number 4. The Shulchan Aruch begins Asur litom klum kodem sheyikadesh. It is forbidden for a person to taste anything before you do kiddush on Friday night. Afilu maim, even water. Now, Rabotai, we're going to go ahead and we're going to try to dissect this one part of the halakha, because we'll see that there's different parts in this one halakha. Like the next halakha is going to speak about even if you began during the day. What does that mean during the day? What did you begin during the day? So this halakha is not going back with this halakha. This halakha is a completely different halakha. It's going to speak about what happens if you sat down to eat a meal before Shabbat even started. You didn't even accept Shabbat. You just wanted to have a bread meal. And then you realize that you're going into Shabbat. Can you continue the meal? Halakha says no. Tzarich la'afsik, you need to stop. Shepores mapan, you're going to go ahead and you're going to put like a challah, like a form of covering over the bread, umekadesh, and then you're going to do the kiddush. So we'll see, Rabotai, that each step is a different step, but let's focus on the first part of the Shulchan Aruch, where he stated, Asur litom klum kodem sheyikadesh, that it is forbidden for a person to taste anything prior to doing kiddush on Friday night, afilu maim, even water. So if we're going to go to the Mishnah Berurah says in Simchat and Yud Aleph, Asur litom, right? We said that it is forbidden to taste anything prior to doing kiddush on Friday night. So the Mishnah Berurah says, V'zehu rak isur derabanan. This whole prohibition of not tasting anything prior to doing kiddush on Friday night is only a prohibition from the rabbis. Ve'hatam, and the reason why the rabbis have instituted, Kevin dichiyuv shel hakiddush chal alav miyad, since the obligation of kiddush takes immediate effect on him, b'kenisat Shabbat, once Shabbat came in, v'afilu lo kibel alav Shabbat, even if you didn't accept upon yourself Shabbat, behedi openly, dekevan shenaseh savcha sheikha, since it became twilight, mimela chal alav Shabbat, the Shabbat falls on him by itself. Now, Rabotai, we have to understand, very important, what is the Mishnah Berurah telling us over here? The Mishnah Berurah is telling us two important points. Number one, with the Shabbat coming in, automatically that obligates you in Kiddush. So once Shabbat comes in, it obligates you in Kiddush. Therefore, you are no longer allowed to go ahead and taste anything, because now you have an obligation to do Kiddush. However, he says, even if you didn't accept Shabbat openly, you didn't light the candles, or you forgot to light the candles that Shabbat, you didn't daven Aravit, you didn't even say I want to accept Shabbat, doesn't matter. Once it's twilight, you are no longer allowed to eat anything. Because remember, by us, Shabbat comes in at sunset, not when the 3 stars come out. Because when the 3 stars come out, you have that whole period prior to then, which is the twilight period, where we say, maybe it's night, maybe it's day. Since we are dealing with a Torah prohibition, we're going to tell you to be stringent. So therefore, we accept Shabbat with sunset. So all the Mishnah Berurah is telling us over here is, when he says that you're not allowed to taste anything prior to Kiddush, he wants to say that this whole prohibition of not tasting anything is only the Rabbanan. And the reason being is, כיוון דחיוב של הקידוש חל עליו מיד בכניסת שבת, since the obligation of kiddush falls on you immediately with the Shabbat coming in, אפילו לא קיבל עליו שבת בהדיע, even if you didn't accept upon yourself Shabbat openly, דכיוון שנעשה ספק חשיכה, once twilight begins, ממילא חל עליו שבת. Shabbat falls on the person by itself. It doesn't have to ask you any questions. ואם קיבל עליו שבת אפילו עדיין יום גדול, what happens if a person accepted Shabbat while it was still day? Because a person can, after Plaga Mincha, go ahead and accept Shabbat. What happens if a person went ahead and did accept Shabbat while it is still day outside? Say an hour before candle lighting. Dina hachi, the same halacha is going to apply. You are no longer allowed to taste anything. If a person wants to accept upon himself Shabbat while it is still day, ulikadesh, and to go ahead and do kiddush, uleachol, and then to go ahead and eat, ulitpalel aravit acher kach balayla, and then to daven aravit afterwards at night, rasha, you are allowed to do so. Rabotai, you hear what the Mishnah was saying? If a person wants to accept upon himself Shabbat, let's say an hour before sunset, because more than that, Rabotai, you cannot do 2 hours before sunset, because you have to be after the Plaga Mincha time. So let's say a person went ahead and he wanted to accept upon himself Shabbat an hour earlier, right? For whatever reason, he wants to go to sleep early. Maybe the kids need to go to sleep early, or maybe you have elderly people in the house. So you want to accept Shabbat early. You want to go ahead now and do the kiddush, and then you want to go ahead and eat. And afterwards, you want to go ahead and you want to daven aravit. Not a big deal. You're allowed to do so. Rabotai, you hear that? And that's what he's telling you here. If you want to accept upon yourself Shabbat while it is still day, and then to go ahead and do the kiddush, and then to go ahead and have your meal, no problem. Go ahead, do it. Be my guest. And afterwards, you're going to go ahead and daven aravit. Balayla at night, Rasha, you're allowed to go ahead and you're allowed to do so. However, he makes one important condition, ubetanai, with the condition, you have to make sure that when you're beginning to eat this bread meal, and it has to be half an hour before the time of Aravit, Kidil b'simin reish lamed hey, siv bet, like it's brought down above in simin reish lamed hey in siv bet. You know something? Let me try to see if I could see that halacha. Let's see that halacha together. I did not prepare, but let me see if I could get it. But we say halacha number 2, correct? Here we go. Here. Asur ladchil lechol chatzi sha'a samach lezman kriyat shema shel aravit. It is forbidden for one to begin eating half an hour close to the time of the kriyat shema of the evening. Right? So this is the halacha we want to see about that. That's all. This is what we want to see right here. I'm not going to go through the whole halacha, but there is a halacha which states in the Shulchan Aruch in Siman Reish Lamed Hey, which is Siman 235 in halacha number 2, that you're not allowed to begin a bread meal within 30 minutes of the time you have to go ahead and say Kriyat Shema. For example, let's say when the 3 stars come out, it is at 6:30. Now you came home at 6 o'clock on a regular day. Has nothing to do right now with Shabbat, on a regular day. If you went ahead and you wanted to go ahead and begin the meal after 6 o'clock, a bread meal, you're not allowed to do it. You first have to say Kriyat Shema, and only then can you have bread meal. So that's what he's trying to tell us over here. Asur latchil lechol chatzi sha'a. It is forbidden for a person to eat a half an hour. Samach lezman Kriyat Shema shel aravit. Close to the time of the Kriyat Shema of the evening. So basically, within the half an hour close to the Shema, you're not allowed to go ahead and have any bread meal. So this is what the Mishnah Berurah tells you. The Mishnah Berurah tells you like this. Ubetanai, and with the condition, shehiyeh chatzi sha'a, that we want you to be able to begin this meal on Friday night, half an hour kodem zman ma'ariv, before the time of Aravit. Kidil el b'simin reish lamed hey siv bet, like it's brought down above in simin reish lamed hey in siv bet. So it comes out of here like this, Rabotai, that if a person wants to go ahead and he wants to accept Shabbat, let's say 1 hour early, let's just make some sort of calculation. Let's say Shabbat comes in at 6 o'clock. And we know, let's say Shabbat is, let's say 6 o'clock, so then you have 18 minutes, right? So let's say 6:18, and then we have those Ben Shmashot, the twilight period. Let's say, Rabotai, let's just make it round off the numbers. Let's say at 6:30. For example, say 6:30 is when the 3 stars come out. Now, you accept the Shabbat, let's say after 5 o'clock. Now you went out and you did the kiddush. Now you're going to go out and you're going to eat. You have to make sure that when you're beginning to eat, it should be before 6 o'clock. If you began before 6 o'clock, it's not a problem. But you shouldn't begin after 6 o'clock till 6:30. In that half an hour, you do not want to begin. That's what the Mishnah Berurah telling us over here, Rabotai. So let's do it one more time. Let me highlight this, a different color. If you want to accept upon yourself Shabbat while it is still day, and to go ahead and do the kiddush, and then to go ahead and have your bread meal, and then go and daven aravit afterwards at night, Rasha, you are permitted to do so, and with the condition, it has to be a half an hour before the time of Aravit. Before the time, you have to go ahead and say the Kriyat Shema, like I explained. Now, Rabotai, a lot of us, Baruch Hashem, probably will not go against this halacha, meaning we're not going to have to ever face such a situation, but I'll tell you where this halacha is very important. I don't know how many of you guys have ever been in a Hasidic shul or a Litvish shul, in Monsey or in Lakewood. Their Aravit davening is Aravit davening. They don't daven for 15 minutes. They could daven for 45 minutes. I've been in one of these places in Monsey. 1 hour is like a real davening. They sing, they take their time, they do everything, they do slow. So, over there, Rabotai, what did we do? We davened Mincha, we accepted Shabbat, we went home, we had a whole meal right in somebody's house in Monsey. Afterwards, we came back for Aravit. Forget it, I think Aravit was till 11 o'clock. That's how late, Rabotai, that's how late they go. They daven, they sing, they enjoy, they learn Torah. So again, Rabotai, are you allowed to do it? You're allowed to do it. Another scenario, let's say, you are invited to somebody's house. Very, very critical. Now, you can't trust their hechsher. You don't want to offend them. It might be your in-laws, it might be your parents, it might be your cousin. I don't know. You don't want to offend them. So you have an option how to go around it. Accept Shabbat early. Don't daven Arvit. Daven Mincha, do Kabbalah Shabbat. Accept Shabbat early. Go ahead and have the meal with your wife. Make sure it's before half an hour of the stars coming out. And then go to shul like normal. And daven Arvit to the people. And then go to the people's house. But you already did your meal. So let the guy do kiddush. He's going to give you bread. If you want to wash again. If you don't want to say, I'm not hungry. Whatever it might be. But I'm just trying to tell you that there are ways that this halacha can come in handy. Okay? So this is very important to know. Now let's go back over here. Let's go back to the Shulchan Aruch. So we did see all that. So when the Shulchan Aruch says here, Asur litom klum kodem shikadesh, that it is forbidden for a person to taste anything before he does kiddush. Right? So now let's see the next Mishnah Berurah. Siv katan yudbet kodem shikadesh. Here we go, Rabotai. Before you're going to do kiddush, you're not allowed to taste anything. Correct? That's what the halacha said. Vafilu ein lo elokos echad. Now the Mishnah says, what happens if all you have is 1 cup of wine? Rabotai, I just want to tell you as a side point, as I learn these halachot, as I learn Torah, I don't want to say it's crazy, but I want to say it's scary how the Torah prepared the Jewish people for a certain type of lifestyle. Because, Rabotai, what do you mean you only have 1 cup of wine? That means he's not able to afford more than 1 cup of wine. And Chas v'Shalom, Rabotai, in certain places, like I've been in Israel in the winter break, Rabotai, and I saw people, how many people, Baruch Hashem, are helping, but how many people need that help? So don't think just because you have 1 bottle of wine, don't think everybody else has it. This is one of our biggest mistakes. We think that if it's good by us, it's good by everybody. But that's not true, Rabotai. That's not true. You have no idea. You should never know, Rabotai, how many people don't have the bare minimum to get through the month. You guys are probably not rabbis that are listening to what I'm saying now, But Rabotai, we get many phone calls of parents that can't pay for their tuition. They can't afford this, they can't afford that, they can't afford the basic necessities, Rabotai. Some parents don't know what chicken is, some parents don't know what meat is. Some people eat meat every single day. These people don't eat meat. Who knows how long? They say only on holidays, or Shoshana, Pesach, Sukkot, maybe then if they get charity funds, only then can they eat meat. Rabotai, if it's good by you, don't think it's good by everybody. You see what the Mishnah is saying over here. Who is he speaking to? Who's the Mishnah speaking to? Because Rabotai, look at the Torah already planned out how life can be chasru shalom lo inu. So the Mishnah says, even if all you have is 1 cup of wine, yikadesh alav, do kiddush on it, ve'varech birkat hamazon below cost, and bless birkat hamazon without a cup of wine. Ha'inu, which means to say, afilu lema'an, even according to the one, the svirili that holds birkat hamazon te'una cost, that birkat hamazon needs a cup of wine, le'el above b'siman kuf pei bet in sif bet in Halacha, bet in chapter 182, even though you have an opinion that learns that whenever you're doing birkat hamazon, even though we don't paskin like that halachically speaking, but even according to that opinion, if when it comes to Shabbat and you only have 1 cup of wine, he's also going to agree, do kiddush first, then go ahead and bless birkat hamazon without having a cup of wine. So let's do that without the parentheses. Even if all you have is 1 cup, yikadesh alav v'yivarech birkat hamazon below cost, do kiddush on it and bless birkat hamazon without a cup of wine. V'lo yochal kodem shikadesh. Still, he says, do not eat before you do the kiddush. Rabotai, look how important that is. Look how important this is, Rabotai. I would have thought to say, since you have an opinion in the Shulchan Aruch and Siman Kuf Pei Bet, in Sif Bet that holds that you have to say birkat hamazon on a cup of wine, so maybe I'm exempt from doing kiddush before eating. Comes the Mishmur and says, no, you must go ahead and do the kiddush first on Friday night, and only then can you begin to eat. Don't think otherwise. Don't think I'm able to eat since you only have 1 cup of wine, and then I'll say the birkat hamazon on a cup of wine, because what's one of the opinions in the Shulchan Aruch, that's what is brought down. He says, no, you're not allowed to do that. That's what he tells you over here, that whatever you're going to do, you're not allowed to eat before you do kiddush. Even if you have 1 cup of wine, you first must go ahead, do kiddush, eat, and then you can bless, and you don't have to have a cup of wine. Now, we're going to go ahead back to the Shulchan Aruch, where the Shulchan Aruch stated, right, Asur l'tom klum kodem she'yikadesh, that it is forbidden for a person to taste anything before he does kiddush. I feel mine. Now we want to focus on the word water, right? So if you look into Sif Katan Yud Gimel in the Mishnah Berurah, the Mishnah Berurah says, I feel mine, even water you're not allowed to drink before you do kiddush. However, he says, V'shari l'rchot piv b'mayim. However, he says you are permitted to wash your mouth with water. Since you're not having any kavanah, you're not having any intention for the benefit of the tasting of the water. So therefore he says you're allowed to go ahead and wash your mouth with water prior to kiddush, since your whole kavanah is just to wash and not to get any benefit from the water itself. Now, when we look back into the Shulchan Aruch, now we're going to go ahead and we're going to move on to the next piece of the halacha. So we covered this piece. Okay, so this is very simple. This verse halacha is very simple. Asur l'tom klum kodem shikadesh afilu maim. It is forbidden for a person to taste anything prior to doing kiddush, even water. Now we are moving to the next halacha in that same seif. Va'afilu mitchil mi'be'od yom. Even if you began eating bread during the day, tzarich la'afsik, you need to interrupt. What do you have to do? Shepores mapa, you're going to go ahead and you're going to, basically, mapa is like a bread cover. You're going to put it over your bread, and then you're going to go ahead and do kiddush u'mikadesh. Okay, so one more time. Even if you began eating bread during the day, before Shabbat even came in, tzarich lavsik, you need to interrupt your meal. Shepores mapa, how are you going to interrupt your meal? You're going to go ahead and you're going to start now putting like a covering on the bread. Umikadesh, and then you're going to go ahead and you're going to do kiddush. Now, if we're looking to the Mishnah Berurah in Siv Katan Yud Dalet, where he says tzarich lavsik, correct? We stated in the Shulchan Aruch that if you began eating during the day and now Shabbat came in, it's already sunset, you need to stop. So he says over here, "Va'afal gavdi hitchil beheter," even though you began in a permissible way. Shani hach over here is different. The kiddush shaykh lesuda, because kiddush, it is connected to the meal. Ulechadchila, and initially, ideally, itkun shitkadesh kodem suda. They made the institution that you should do kiddush prior to the bread meal. Ubimakom suda, but it also has to be in the place of the suda. L'chadchila, that's how we want you to always do kiddush. Kiddush has to be done before you have your bread meal, and it has to be in the place where you're going to go and have your bread meal. So that's what he's telling us over here. Even though you began in a permissible way, you began during the day where Shabbat was not even in play. And nevertheless, we're going to tell you over here is very different. Shani hacha, the kiddush shaykh lesuda. Over here is different because the kiddush is connected to the meal. Now you have to understand, what is the Mishnah Berurah saying over here? If you guys remember, in Siman Reish Tzadik Ted, we were learning the halachot of Sudah Shalishit, right? That you have to start the meal before sunset. And we said over there that if you began the meal before sunset, you are allowed to continue even after sunset. So what is the Mishnah Berurah saying? The Mishnah Berurah is telling us over here that the reason when it comes to Friday night, you need to stop because the kiddush and the meal, they come together. First you have to do the kiddush, then you can eat the meal. But over there, by Sudah Shalishit, when you began the meal before sunset, you're allowed to continue even after sunset because Havdalah and the bread meal, one has nothing to do with each other. So that's what he's trying to tell us over here. Even though you began in a permissible way, like in Siman Reish Tzadik Tet and Halacha Aleph, also over there you began Sudah Shalishit in a permissible way. Over there we allow you. But over here he says, over here he's going to tell you that's why. Sha'ani hacha over here is different. The kiddush shaykh lesuda, because the kiddush is connected to the meal. Ulechatchila, and initially or ideally, it killed shikadesh kodem suda or bebakom suda. The Chachamim made the institution that you should do the kiddush prior to the meal and in the place of the meal. So now, so we were saying, even if you began eating during the day, tzarich lavsik. So we understood this. You need to stop, even though you began in a permissible way. Shepores mapa. So now we're going to go ahead and see this Mishnah Berurah. What does it mean, shepores mapa? That you have to go ahead and you have to cover the bread with a type of fabric. So the Mishnah Berurah says in Sivkat and Tet Vav, right over here, Rabotai, shepores mapa. What does it mean? Lechasot apat. You need to cover the bread. Until when? Ad achar kiddush. Until after kiddush. Ve'achar kach yisaren. And afterwards you're going to remove it. Ki heichi. In order to show the ata suda hasha. In order to show that the meal came just now. Likarat Shabbat, for the honor of Shabbat. Now Rabotai, I hope you understand what's happening over here. You have to just imagine for yourself on Friday afternoon, you had a brit milah, or you had a bar mitzvah, whatever it might be, in your house. Forget about music right now. You were just having a brit milah or bar mitzvah, or you were having a meal. Doesn't matter. You sat down earlier, thinking you're going to finish before Shabbat. You sat down and you started eating it. Now you see Shabbat came in. You're like, oh, what are you supposed to do? We're going to tell you, cover the bread like with a challah cover, with any form of a fabric or napkins. Just cover the bread. And we're going to see now, you're going to go ahead and you're going to do the kiddush. And then you're going to remove the napkin or the challah cover from the bread. So it's as if you began the meal anew, right now. That's what he's telling us over here. Lechasot apad, you need to cover the bread. Ad achar kiddush, until after the kiddush. ואחר כך יסרן, and afterwards you're going to remove the cover of the bread. כי in order to show the ata hasuda that the meal comes, hashta now, likarat Shabbat, it comes with the honor of Shabbat. ואף אם הוא לא ישב עדיין לאכול, even though you didn't sit down right now to eat bread, you just doing kiddush for the first time on Shabbat. גם כן דין הכי. Also the halacha is going to be like this. דצריך פריסת מפה בעת הקידוש. You need to go ahead and you need to cover the bread at the time of kiddush. וכדלקמן, like we'll see later on, בסעיף tet in halacha tet. Eila, so what is this coming to teach us over here? Why do you have to tell me over here that you were already eating? Eila the kamashmal, and rather is coming to teach you. But in this, the avshu be'emtza achiloto die bepirisat mapa. That even if you are in the middle of your eating the bread, it is enough for you to go ahead and cover the bread with a covering. You don't have to completely clean out your table before you do kiddush. So we need to understand what the Mishnah Berurah is saying. The Mishnah Berurah is saying over here that if you would have sat down to go ahead and do kiddush and then have a bread meal, we said over here, ve'af im lo yashav adayin, right over here, 1 second. Right? Ve'af im lo yashav adayin lechol gam ken din hachi. Even if you didn't sit to eat, the halacha is going to be the same halacha. You are obligated to go ahead and cover the bread. You need to go ahead and you have to cover the bread with a covering. Beta kiddush at the time when you're doing kiddush, like we're going to see later on in halacha tet. So if that is the whole halacha, why did you have to tell me in this situation where I began my meal in a permissible way? So comes the Mishnah Berurah and tells you a very big kiddush over here. Eila, why did we have to take this case? Eila, the kamashmalan, it's coming to teach us. But in this halacha, the avshu be'emtza achiloto, that even if you are in the middle of your eating, dai beperisat mapa, it is enough for you to go ahead and cover the bread with a covering, and you do not have to clean out the whole table before you do kiddush. This is over here the whole novelty of the Mishnah Berurah. Now, let's go back to the Shulchan Aruch. So we did this and we did this. So let's just do it together. Asur latom klum kodem shikadesh afilu mayim. One is forbidden to taste anything before he does kiddush, even water. Even if you began eating a bread meal during the day, tzarich lahafsik, you need to go ahead and interrupt your bread meal. Shepores mapa, how? By putting a fabric or napkin or a challah cover over the bread. Umikadesh, and you're going to go ahead and you're going to do kiddush. Now we're moving to the next step in the halacha. What happens if a person, while he was in the bread meal, he had a cup of wine? What is the halacha going to say in regards to that situation? So the Shulchan Aruch states, V'im hayu shotin yain techila, if you were having wine initially. Eino omer ela kiddush bilvad, you are only allowed to say the kiddush blessing alone, below birkat hayayin, without the blessing of the wine. And afterwards you're going to go ahead and you're going to bless the blessing of hamotzi lechem in haaretz. Now Rabotai, you have to understand what's happening over here. If I'm right now in my bread meal prior to the onset of Shabbat, and during the bread meal I went ahead and I said Borei Pri Gefen and a cup of wine, why did I have to say the blessing of Borei Pri Gefen and a cup of wine? Because the blessing of hamotzi does not cover the blessing of Borei Pri Gefen. So therefore I had to make a separate blessing. So what happens if during my meal I went ahead and I said the blessing on wine? So comes the Shulchan Aruch and he tells you, since you already blessed on the wine during the meal prior to the onset of Shabbat, now when you're going to go and say the kiddush, because kiddush interrupts you from continue eating, you have to say the kiddush alone without saying the blessing of Borei Pri Gefen. However, after you do the kiddush, even though you already said the blessing of hamotzi lechem in haaretz earlier, prior to Shabbat, nevertheless, the opinion in the Shulchan Aruch, in this opinion, he says, afterwards you're still going to go and you're going to bless hamotzi lechem in haaretz. Here, watch this, Rabotai. V'im hayu shotin yain techila, and if they were drinking wine initially, meaning during the meal, eina omer el kiddush belvad. You are only going to say the kiddush blessing alone, belo birkat hayain, without the blessing of the wine. Ve'acher kach mevarech birkat hamotzi, and afterwards you're going to bless the blessing of hamotzi lechem min haaretz. Rabotai, you see that? Even though you already said hamotzi lechem min haaretz prior to Shabbat, nevertheless you're going to have to go ahead and you're going to do another hamotzi lechem min haaretz. So let's go ahead and see the Mishnah Berurah on this. The Mishnah Berurah in Sivkat and Tezayin says, Belo birkat hayayin. Right? We said in the Shulchan Aruch that if you had wine during the meal prior to the onset of Shabbat, now when you're going to go ahead and you're going to do kiddush on the wine, you're not going to say the blessing of Borei Peri Geffen, you are only going to say the kiddush of the day. That's all. So the Mishnah Berurah explains the reason why. The kiven diberech kvar betoch hasuda, since you're already blessed in the middle of the meal, b'techilat shtiyatato, in the beginning of your drinking, shuv ein tzarich levarech ata, borei pri hagefen, you no longer need to bless now, borei pri hagefen, kodem hakiddush, prior to kiddush. Since you already went ahead and you blessed borei pri hagefen in your bread meal, now when you're going again and doing the kiddush, you don't have to say Borei Peri Geffen, but you are only going to say the kiddush blessing. Vehu adin, the same halacha is going to apply. She'ein tzarich levarech al hayayin shebetoch hasuda. You also don't need to bless on the wine which is going to come in the middle of the meal, meaning of the Shabbat meal. Why? Deha en shum heisek adaat ben shtiyat hakos shel kiddush lishtiyat hayayin shebetoch hasuda. Because, Rabotai, you have to understand, there's no interruption from when you were drinking the cup of wine, where you bless the kiddush blessing, to the wine that you're going to be drinking in the middle of your meal. So what happens is over here like this. If I began my meal before Shabbat, and I had Borei Peri Geffen, I had a cup of wine during my meal. Well, I don't drink wine, so, I mean, unless it's 4 cups of wine for Pesach, Shabbat, Yom Tov, otherwise I'm not drinking no wine. I'm not a person, I don't like alcohol, I stay away from alcohol and all these things. Doesn't matter, but I'm just giving an example. Let's say in my bread meal, I had a cup of wine and I said Borei Peri Geffen on it. So I drank. So now Shabbat came in. Shabbat is going to interrupt me from allowing me to continue my meal. So what do I have to do? I have to now go ahead and do kiddush. So I take a cup of wine, I take another cup of wine, and I start saying the kiddush part alone without saying Borei Peri Geffen. Then I'm going to drink the cup of wine. Afterwards, I'm going to go to wash my hands. And then again, Rabotai, I'm going to say hamotzi lechem min haaretz on the bread. Once I did that, now in the middle of that meal of Shabbat, I will have more wine. The Mishnah Berurah says, no problem, you don't have to bless on it. Even though you didn't bless on this, you don't have to bless on that. Why? Because when I drank this cup of wine, which is the kiddush cup of wine, even though I didn't say Borei Peri Geffen, because it was already taken out from the Borei Peri Geffen, I said prior to Shabbat, from this cup of wine, from the kiddush to the cup of wine of the meal, there's no, basically, I didn't take my mind off. That's why you don't have to go back and bless again. So that's what he's telling us over here, Rabotai. Let's see that one more time. The kiven diberech kvar betoch hasuda, since you're already blessed in the middle of the meal, betichila shtiyatato, in the beginning of your drinking, shuv ein tzarich levarech ata Borei Peri Geffen kodem kiddush. You no longer need to bless Borei Peri Geffen prior to kiddush. V'huadin, the same halacha is going to apply. She'ein tzarich levarech al hayayin shebetoch hasuda. You don't have to bless on the wine in the middle of the meal, meaning of the Shabbat meal. Why? Deha en shum heisek adaat ben shtiyat hakos shel kiddush lishtiyat hayayin shebetoch hasuda. Because you didn't take your mind off from the drinking of the cup of the kiddush to drinking the wine in the middle of the Shabbat meal. Okay. Now, Rabotai, we said over here, after you went ahead and you did the kiddush without saying the blessing of Borei Peri Geffen, since you already had wine prior to Shabbat, comes the Shulchan Aruch says, afterwards, you're going to go ahead and you're going to bless the blessing of hamotzi lechem min haaretz. So if we go to Mishnah Berurah Katan Yud Zayin, afterwards you're going to come and you're going to bless the blessing of hamotzi lechem min haaretz. So what does this mean? Which means to say, כשבא לגמור אחר כך סעודתו, when you're coming to complete afterwards your meal, מברך ברכת המוציא מחדש. You have to bless the blessing of המוציא לחם מן הארץ from the start again. דאיני יוצא בהמוציא שברך בתחילת הסעודה. Because you do not fulfill your obligation for the hamotzi blessing that you blessed prior to this Shabbos meal. Why? Lefi she'akiddush benetam, because the kiddush in the meanwhile shaya tzarich lomro, that you needed to say mipnei she'nestar ba'achila, because it was forbidden for you to eat ad she'ikades, until you do kiddush. Ze have hefsek. That's considered to be an interruption. So we have to understand what the Mishnah is telling us over here. The Mishnah is saying something very beautiful. Don't think that the hamotzi blessing that you blessed prior to the meal of Shabbat is going to allow you to go ahead and just continue eating your bread without a problem. Don't do that. You can't. What the Mishnah is telling us is like this. The hamotzi blessing that you said prior to Shabbat will not help you for the bread after the kiddush. Why? Because the kiddush is considered to be an interruption between the two eatings. It interrupts your meal. So once it interrupts, it's basically separating the two barachot. So that's what we're going to tell you. When you bless hamotzi prior to the onset of Shabbat, that's good for then. Now when you're beginning a new meal after you said kiddush, you have to go back and you have to say another blessing of hamotzi lechem min haaretz. Once you say the blessing of hamotzi lechem min haaretz, now you're allowed to continue eating. Okay, Rabotai? So I'm going to take something back. I said earlier, I said you have to go and you have to wash your hands. From this Mishnah, it's mashma, you don't have to wash your hands. You could continue eating. All you're going to do is go ahead and say hamotzi lechem min haaretz. All right, let's see that one more time. We said, and afterwards you're going to go ahead and you're going to bless the blessing of hamotzi lechem min haaretz. Which means to say, when you're going to come afterwards to complete your meal, you're going to bless Birkat HaMotzi from the beginning. Why do you have to bless again? You're not going to fulfill your obligation with the Hamotzi blessing, that you blessed in the beginning of the meal prior to Shabbat. Because this kiddush that you did in the meanwhile, where you were obligated to say it, because it was forbidden for you to continue eating, until you do kiddush. So that kiddush, that's considered to be an interruption between the hamotzi that you said prior to kiddush, meaning before Shabbat, and the hamotzi that you're going to say after kiddush on Shabbat. That kiddush interrupts these two hamotzis. That's you have to go back and you have to say hamotzi lechem min haaretz again. Therefore, he says, therefore, tzarich levarech shenit birkat hamotzi. Therefore, you need to go back and you need to bless birkat hamotzi a second time. However, when it comes to the blessing of birkat hamazon, what about birkat hamazon? How many times do you have to do birkat hamazon? Or birkat hamazon rak pamachat. When it comes to birkat hamazon, you only have to say it one time, besof hasuda, towards the end of the meal. Mashe'enken, but which wouldn't be the case. Kishe'en lo yain. Now we're going to see what happens if he does not have wine. Umikadesh alapat, and he's doing the kiddush on bread. Shizman birkat hamotzi shelo hu kodem kiddush. That the time of the blessing of hamotzi lechem min haaretz, when you're doing the kiddush on the bread, is prior to kiddush. V'lo haya adayin hefsek. There was no interruption still. That you're going to need to go ahead and bless a second time. Therefore, everybody's going to tell you, do not need to bless hamotzi. So, Rabotai, we need to explain this Mishnah Berurah. It's very important. The Mishnah Berurah was telling us up to now that when you have wine and you're doing the kiddush on the wine, and since the blessing on the bread, its time is prior to the kiddush, then we're going to tell you it's not considered to be an interruption. There was nothing to interrupt because the kiddush and the bread, they're part of one and the same. But when you have the wine is what's going to interrupt the blessing of hamotzi from one another. But when you have the wine and you're doing the kiddush on the bread, so the kiddush is part of the bread. So there's nothing interrupting the hamotzi blessing from one another. Therefore, when you're coming back to eat a second time On Shabbat itself, after you do the kiddush on the bread, you don't have to say hamotzi lechem min haaretz. Let's see that Rabotai one more time. Masha'enkin, which would be the case kishe'en lo yain, when you don't have wine, umikadesh al pat, and you're blessing, or better yet, and you're doing the kiddush on the bread. Shizman birkat hamotzi shelo, that the time of the blessing of hamotzi, of its blessing of hamotzi of the bread, who is kodem kiddush, is prior to kiddush, just like by the wine. There was no interruption yet. That he needs to go ahead and he has to bless because of that a second time. Therefore, we're going to tell you, therefore, we're going to tell you, do not need to bless according to everyone. Okay, now Rabotai, so we did that halacha. Let's go back to the Shulchan Aruch. So the Shulchan Aruch said, Asur litom klum kodem shikadesh afilu mayim. It is forbidden for one to taste anything prior to doing kiddush, even water. Even if you began having a bread meal prior to Shabbat, meaning during the day, you need to interrupt your bread meal. You're going to go ahead and you're going to cover it with a form of covering. And you're going to go ahead and you're going to do kiddush. And if you were drinking wine initially in that bread meal, you're only going to say the kiddush without the blessing on the wine. And afterwards you're going to go ahead and you're going to bless the blessing of hamotzi lechem min haaretz. And we saw, when is this blessing said, Rabotai? That's only if you're doing kiddush on a cup of wine. But if you're doing kiddush on bread, you don't have to bless the blessing of hamotzi lechem min haaretz a second time. Next piece of halacha in the Shulchan Aruch in Seif Daled. What happens if a person doesn't have wine and he's doing the kiddush on the bread, like we just saw in the Mishnah Berurah? You do not bless hamotzi lechem min haaretz. Let me just see something over here. Okay. Rabotai, I did realize we're in the Mishnah Berurah, in the Amodei Hora'ah. We have to do, right over on the bottom, Rabotai, we're going to have to do with you one Amodei Hora'ah, which I did not do. We'll do it after we finish all this whole thing. We'll be able to go ahead and just run right through it. Okay. So we said, if you don't have wine and you are doing kiddush on bread, like we saw in the Mishnah Berurah, you do not say hamotzi lechem min haaretz. Again, when is all this? When you are in the middle of a bread meal prior to the onset of Shabbat. And there are those that say, here we go. Even when you're doing the kiddush on the wine, you don't bless hamotzi lechem min haaretz. Rabotai, I hope you guys just understood what just happened over here. Let me do this color right over here. This is very fascinating. Let me just go back over here for a second. If a person was drinking wine initially in the bread meal prior to the onset of Shabbat, you're only going to say the kiddush alone without the blessing of Bari Geffen. But again, what are you saying the kiddush on? You're saying the kiddush on a cup of wine. And afterwards you're going to go ahead and you're going to bless the blessing of hamotzi a second time, because you're doing the kiddush on the cup of wine. And we saw the Mishnah Berurah said, because the kiddush have a hefsek. The kiddush is an interruption between the hamotzi prior to the Shabbos meal to the hamotzi after Shabbat came in the Shabbos meal itself. Right? And then the Shulchan Aruch continued and he said, now only if you don't have wine and you're doing the kiddush on the bread, because you're doing the kiddush on the bread, so there's no real interruption. However, come to V'yesh Omrim, they say something fascinating. No, they want to tell you no. V'yesh Omrim, there are those that say she'av kishemikadesh al hayayin. So this is Yesh Omrim Rabotai, that even if you're doing the kiddush on the cup of wine, einu mevarech hamotzi, still you're not going to say hamotzi. So they're arguing with the Stam opinion. Rabotai, this over here, where it says ve'achar kach mevarech birkat hamotzi. Let me make this a different color. That this is the Stam opinion, this is the Yesh Omrim opinion. We know the rule is whenever you have Stam v'yesh, halacha kistam. whenever you have yesh v'yesh, halacha ki yesh, omrim batra, meaning like the second yesh omrim. However, Rabotai, when you look at this Shulchan Aruch, so you would have thought to say that maybe the halacha is like the stam. The Mishnah Berurah is going to say otherwise. Why? We're going to see the Mishnah Berurah is going to explain that whenever you have a suffix, if you have to bless a blessing or not, even if it's against the Shulchan Aruch, we're going to tell you, you can't be lenient. So even though the Shulchan Aruch is going to tell us over here that when you're doing the kiddush on a cup of wine, and even though the kiddush is considered to be an interruption between the hamotzi blessings, like I explained, and he's going to tell you have to bless hamotzi a second time, nevertheless, about that halacha is going to be like the yesh omrim. That even if you're doing the kiddush on the wine, doesn't matter about that. You cannot bless a blessing of hamotzi a second time. Why is that? So if we look into the Mishnah Berurah, in Siv Katan Yudchet, he says, why, according to this Yesh Omrim, you're not allowed to bless the blessing of Hamotzi left from the Aretz? The Sfira Lehu, because they held the Kiddush Lohavi Hefsik. They learned that the Kiddush that you're doing on a cup of wine is not considered to be an interruption between the Hamotzi prior to the meal and the Hamotzi after the meal. It's not considered to be an interruption. Once it's not an interruption, therefore you don't have to say Hamotzi left from the Aretz a second time around after the kiddush. V'kiv the safek berachot lakel, since we know the rule that whenever you have a doubt in blessings, we're going to be lenient. Yesh litfos ke yesh omrim, and that's the halacha rabotai. You have to go ahead and you have to grab the halacha like the yesh omrim, that if a person had a bread meal prior to Shabbat and you had wine, or even if you didn't have wine, and now you're going to go ahead and you're going to do kiddush on a cup of wine, kiddush is not considered to be an interruption between the hamotzi prior to the kiddush and hamotzi after the kiddush. So therefore, when you want to begin eating your bread again, you're not going to say hamotzi, you're just going to say the kiddush, then you're going to go ahead and you're going to say hamotzi lechem min haaretz, and without the washing of the hands also. Now, Rabotai, there is a Amodeh Hora'ah in Rabbi Dan Sefer. Over here he says, we spoke about over here, that one is not allowed to have water, right? We spoke about it right over here. Let me just go over with you the Sivkat Yud Aleph one more time, and then we're going to see what Rabbi Dahan is going on. We said over here, Asur L'tom, you're not allowed to taste anything prior to doing Kiddush on Shabbat. V'zeu rak isur d'Rabbanan, and we explained that this is only a prohibition from the rabbis. V'atam, and the reason being is, Kim d'chiyuv shal Kiddush chal alav miyad, Shabbat, since the obligation of the Kiddush takes immediate effect on you once Shabbat comes in. Here we go. This is what we want to focus on, Rabotai. Even if you didn't accept Shabbat on yourself openly, the so we're going to see two halachot now. Since it's already twilight, Shabbat falls on you by itself. That's number one. We're going to see something over there regarding twilight. Right now we see from over here that even if you didn't openly accept Shabbat, during the twilight period, you're not allowed to have any water or anything for that fact. However, the next halakha we also want to see, V'im kibal alav Shabbat afilu adan yom gadol dina hachi. Even if you went out and you accepted Shabbat while it was still day outside, we're going to tell you the same halakha is going to apply. That means if a person accepted Shabbat an hour earlier, let's say sunset is at 6, and you accept the Shabbat at 5 o'clock, according to what we're learning now, the same halakha that Mishnah Berurah says is going to apply just as if Shabbat entered. Because for you it's already Shabbat. You can't turn on the light. Once you accept Shabbat, you can't turn on the light. So that's what he says here, Rabotai, if you accepted upon yourself Shabbat while it was still day, Dina Haki, the same halakha is going to apply. You're not allowed to taste anything. Wait, but I have an hour to go, Rabbi. Doesn't matter. For you, it's Shabbat, just like you cannot do any malacha, so you're not allowed to eat, drink, or do anything else until you're going to do Kiddush. So we see over here two halachot. Halakha number one, we're going to try to see. Twilight. Is one allowed to have water, tea, or coffee during twilight, according to Chacham Ovadia and Rav Yitzchak Yosef Shlitam? Another thing we're going to want to see, what happens if a person accepted upon himself Shabbat, let's say an hour earlier than Shabbat? Do we follow this Mishnah Berurah, or are we going to tell you, no, you're allowed to go ahead and have water even if you accept the Shabbat during the day. So if you look into the Amodei Hora'ah in Ot Yud Aleph, he says like this. V'chein pasak b'Kaf HaChaim. And so too, the Kaf HaChaim made this Pasak Halacha. She'im kibel Shabbat. If a person accepts the Shabbat, or he gives man ben hashmashot, meaning you accept the Shabbat prior to Shabbat, like an hour earlier, or even 15 minutes earlier, or if the time of the twilight already came, meaning sunset set, asur letom ad shikadas. He goes clear like the Mishnah Berurah. The Kaf HaChaim says the word for word like the Mishnah Berurah. It is forbidden for you to taste anything until you do kiddush. V'chein hu beben ish chai. And so too the same halacha is going to apply in the ben ish chai. They are going to hold, the Kaf HaChaim and the ben ish chai are going to tell you that once sunset hits, you're not allowed to eat, you're not allowed to drink, you're not allowed to do anything. And if you accept the Shabbat prior to Shabbat, say 20 minutes earlier or even an hour earlier, they're both going to tell you for your Shabbat, you're not allowed to eat, drink, or do anything else until you do kiddush. Aval, however, that hachazon ovadia, the opinion of Chacham Ovadia is, shebemokum torich, if there is a need, if there is a great need, mutar l'shtot maim o teh o kafeh, you're allowed to drink water, tea, or coffee, afilu im kibel Shabbat ba'amirat hayachid or ba'adlakat haner. Even if you accept the Shabbat by mere speech, or you said, I want to accept Shabbat earlier during the day, or you lit the candles and you said, I want to accept Shabbat. Kol or shaloit palal arvit shel Shabbat. As long as you didn't daven arvit of Shabbat, Chacham Ovadia is going to tell you that in this halacha where the Mishnah Berurah tells you over here, v'im, right over here, Rabotai. Let me just do another color so we could be on the same page. Right, let's do yellow. V'im kibel alav Shabbat afil adan yom gadol dina haki. According to the Mishnah Berurah, the Ben Ish Chai, the Kaf HaChaim, they're telling you that once you accept the Shabbat during the day, the halach is going to tell you you're not allowed to eat, you're not allowed to drink, you're not allowed to do anything because the Shabbat for you. Comes Chacham Ovadia says, whether you said you want to accept Shabbat during the day, or whether you accept the Shabbat through the lighting of the candles, as long as you didn't daven aravit, you're allowed to go ahead and you're allowed to drink water, tea, or coffee if there is a great need for you to go ahead and do it. But if there's no need, he's going to agree with the Mishnah Berurah, the Ben Ish Chai, and the Kaf HaChaim. So according to Chacham Ovadia, it's implied that only up to sunset can you go ahead and use this leniency of Chacham Ovadia, where you're allowed to drink water, tea, or coffee, where you are allowed to drink water, tea, or coffee in a time of need, even if you accept the Shabbat during the day. That's implied only until sunset. But after sunset, we're going to tell you, he's going to agree with what the Mishnah Berurah tells us over here. Va'afilu, rather read this one, let's make it red. Va'afilu lo kibel alav Shabbat, even if you don't accept the Shabbat openly, the once it becomes twilight, immediately Shabbat falls out on him by itself. Over here is Mashal from the Chacham Ovadia that he agrees with this. However, comes Rabbi Dan and he says, he brings Rav Yitzchak Yosef Shatan, he says like this, V'katav b'Yalkut Yosef, and it's written in the Yalkut Yosef, sheyesh la'akel b'zeh, you could be lenient in the case of tea, water, and coffee, afilu kvar shika'ah hachama, even if the sun already set. Calls man ben hashmashot, as long as it's twilight, you're allowed to go ahead and you're allowed to be lenient. He continues and he says, so how come Chacham Ovadia didn't use it? Chacham Ovadia, he says, meant the same thing. I'm not going to go through the whole thing. The bottom line, we're going to see, Rabotai, that according to Chacham Ovadia and Rav Yitzchak Yosef Shtitam, whether it's after sunset or whether it's before sunset and you accept upon yourself Shabbat, whether through mere speech or through candle lighting, as long as you did not daven aravit, and there is a great need for you to go out and drink, you're allowed to drink water, tea, and coffee. But if there's no great need for you to drink, you should not drink no water, no tea, and no coffee. You have to follow what the Shulchan Aruch says. If you pay close attention, Chacham Ovadia says there's a b'makom hatorich, if there's a need. So therefore, Rabotai, he changes, he adds a few words and he changes the whole halacha. So therefore, Rabotai, only if there's a need, we're going to allow you to go ahead and use this leniency for water, tea, and coffee. However, when it comes for food, you're not allowed to have any food until you do kiddush. So let's just see this right over here, Rabotai. We are in Dalam Moshel Halacha, Siman 271, Halacha for Halacha number 4. Just Halacha what we hold, Rabotai. Chacham Ovadia, in time of need, one would be allowed to drink water, tea, or coffee, even if you accept the Shabbat through speech or lighting the candles, as long as you did not pray Arevit or while it was still day. According to Chacham Ovadia, one may use this leniency until up to sun. However, Rabbi Yitzchak Yosef Shlita allows one to drink in time of need, even during the twilight period. But once the stars came out, one is no longer allowed to drink. Rabotai, let's just do the halacha with you guys in the Shulchan Aruch, and with this we will conclude Siman Reish Ayin Aleph for halacha Daled. B'ezrat Hashem, in the following class, we'll do a complete review, B'li Neder, and afterwards we're going to move on to the next halacha in the Shulchan Aruch. The Shulchan Aruch in Siman Reish Ayin Aleph in halacha Daled states, Asur letom klum kodem shikadesh afilu mayim. One is not allowed to taste anything prior to doing kiddush, even water. And that is the halacha, Rabotai. Even though we saw Chacham Ovadia and Rabbi Yitzchak Yosef allow, remember, Rabotai, that's only in time of need. Even if you began having a bread meal during the day, tzarich lavsik, you need to interrupt. Shepores mapan, you need to go ahead and you need to cover the bread with a covering. Umikadesh, and then you're going to go ahead and you're going to do kiddush. And if you were drinking wine initially in the bread meal, you're only going to say the kiddush blessing alone without the blessing of Borei Pri Gefen. And afterwards you're going to bless the blessing of Hamotzi Lechem in the arts a second time, which we will see that we don't hold like that. What happens if you do not have wine and you're doing the kiddush on the bread? You're not going to bless Hamotzi a second time. And there are those that say, even if you're doing the kiddush on the wine, you're not allowed to bless Hamotzi, and that is halacha l'maaseh. You're not allowed to bless Hamotzi, because according to them, kiddush is not considered to be an interruption between the Hamotzi blessing prior to Shabbat and the Hamotzi blessing during the meal of Shabbat. Rabotai, have a great day. Baruch Adonai Olam. Amen ve'amen.